But, yeah.
Morning, Bucketeers. I'm Joanne Bundy. The planning committee joins me in welcoming you to the third class of our bucket course on South Africa with Professor George Drake and Dr. Ron Charles. We have some techies on our planning committee who are talented enough that they have put together a website for the bucket courses. And they're going to show you how you can register. It's very simple. Even I can do it. So it's really simple. And I'd like you to introduce Judy Hunter and Jack Gustafson, who will show you the simple process of registering. Judy Hunter.
Hi, everybody. This afternoon, sometime, you should receive an email that looks just like this, that says that you can register for Jim Arndt's upcoming course on T.E. Lawrence and the Modern Middle East. You notice that we have one more of these classes to go, and then we have an open Wednesday, which doesn't require registration. So this is way in advance, okay? But when you get the email, you can simply click on this link, and it will take you to our brand spiffy new. Yeah. Okay, and right on the home page, there's a button that says register for course, and you click on that. And it takes you to a page with a registration form and a description of Jim's course. So the description is down here a little bit if you want to read about what it's going to be. This is the same thing that will be in the newspaper soon. But to register, simply click in the text box and put your last name. Jack's doing this to demonstrate.
Jack's going to register.
There he is. And click in this box and put your first name. Click in this box and put your email. And click the box that says submit. And you should get a form that says, can you scroll down a little bit? Scroll up a little bit. So up. There we go. It should tell you your response has been recorded. And if you have two people that you want to register, you can click on this link and it will take you back to the form so you can enter another name. There it is. It takes you back to the form. So we hope it's very easy for you to register. If all else fails, I've given you an email address that you can just send a note to us through that email address. And I would like to mention that although Joanne calls us the techies, it is Kate Baumgartner who actually is the guru behind this page. Thank you, Kate. And now I'd like to introduce George.
Thank you very much, Judy. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, thanks for waving your arms. And thank you all for being here. This is my last day with this course. I talked with Ron Charles last night, and he is looking forward to being here next Wednesday. And my task has been to sort of set you up with the historical background for developments in South Africa, and then with Ron you can have someone who lived through those historical developments and ultimately moved to the United States. So many of you know Ron, and he has done this with my Southern Africa class that I've taught many times at the college, and it's been a surefire session. And I think what he'll do is talk with you about his experience for, if not the bulk, at least most of the first half of the session. And there'll be, my guess is that almost all of the time after break will be your chance to ask him questions and his response to your questions. So I am looking forward to that, as I hope you are. Now, last time we spent time, and with handouts and so on, developing the apartheid system in South Africa, both the theory of apartheid and the Broederbond, which was a sort of dedicated group of Afrikaners that put the apartheid regime in place, and then the actual, not all, but many of the major apartheid laws, and the way in which that worked out. And it related to what we talked about before, because we talked about the various settlement patterns in South Africa and the division between the whites with the English and the Afrikaner populations, and then the efforts that have been made to create tribal reserves for Africans, which were well away from the centers of wealth in the cities. But the tiny problem that the South Africans had, which was they needed black labor, and so developed a system which allowed blacks to come, quote, temporarily to the urban areas to be laborers, but to be aliens with passes and passbooks and so on as they settled and worked outside of their tribal areas. Now, today we're going to talk about the resistance to the apartheid regime and the ways that that resistance finally succeeded with the creation of the new South Africa, and we'll have obviously not the whole story of the creation of the new South Africa, but I think the essential parts of it, and then a little bit on the Bill of Rights of the South African Constitution, which came into being in 1999. By the way, the whole process of creating that Constitution was very interesting. Clearly, the American Constitution was a model that they used, but they also had as a model a document from 1955, the Freedom Charter, which you have in your hands, and we'll talk about that today. But they also drew jurists and legal advisors, lawyers and so on, from all over the world, really, to advise them in the Constitution writing process. And in fact, a lawyer from the University of Iowa Law School, Adrian Wing, who is African-American, was one of those persons who helped in the process of crafting the South African Constitution of 1999. But we're going to go back now to the development of the resistance. The ANC, African National Congress, was founded in 1913, not coincidentally at the same time that they began to create tribal reserves and try to shift African populations to those reserves, allowing the whites to grab most of the best land in South Africa. Now, I'm not going to go into a great detail about the ANC in this period, except to say the easiest way to understand it is to think NAACP. And the easiest way to understand how the NAACP gets left behind is to think about the ways that more radical movements began to displace it as being front and center in a resistance movement. The ANC, just as the NAACP, was led by middle-class blacks, professional blacks. Most of the early leaders of the ANC were physicians. And these are folks, as you can imagine, who have a lot to lose if things get too radical. They're going to lose their practice. They're doing well. They're doing well. They're dedicated to the process of helping other black people do well. But how far and how deep is that dedication when you've got a position to maintain, and a position that you pretty well like, a position of respect? And they're well educated. They know how to speak with whites and deal with whites. But the whites are able to keep them sort of at arm's length with respect to really important changes. So the ANC is a pretty moderate organization until the advent of World War II and large migration of black folks to the cities such as Johannesburg in the war industries that are being developed. So and as we've talked about last time, in many areas such as Transkei, blacks are not being oppressed terribly, and they're doing pretty well living a fairly decent subsistence, community-focused life. Then along comes World War II and this huge shift of population to the urban centers, men particularly dislocated from their families, working in very, very difficult conditions. One of the first really major, interesting actually with U.S. history, one of the first major events that sort of radicalized things with the ANC was a bus boycott. Think of Montgomery and Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s. This was in the 40s. And the bus company raised the fare, and the blacks rebelled against that rise in the fare, began to walk, began to find other means of getting to work and so on in order to try to get the fares brought back to a decent level. Now, a group of young people developed, they called themselves the ANC Youth League. And the leaders of that movement were a man named Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Walter was about 8 or 10 years older than Mandela, and Oliver Tambo. Now, Mandela and Tambo had been at Fort Hare University as students together, so they knew each other. They're ultimately going to establish the only black law firm in Johannesburg. Both become lawyers. Sisulu was actually a real estate person who dealt predominantly in the few places like Sophiatown where blacks could actually buy property in Johannesburg. So it's these three people who come together and begin to push against the more sedate and moderate ANC leadership in forming the ANC Youth League, and they are going to become the spine, the backbone of the ANC we think about today that is a very powerful resistance movement. I guess it's time here to talk a little bit about Mandela, his story. Some of you were in the bucket course I did on leadership in crisis, and we finished with Mandela, so you've been through this in greater detail than I will give you today. But to me, it's an utterly fascinating story. I actually had the opportunity to watch Mandela being, quote, in his presence. He had no idea I was in his presence. But I was there where he was. Once in Parliament, just the way you can go and sit in Congress and watch them perform, I went to the National Assembly meeting one afternoon, and it was a typical legislative session. People reading papers, walking around and back and so on. And they were discussing the budget, so it was a pretty important discussion. And whenever Mandela spoke, everyone stopped and listened. It was really extraordinary. When anyone else was speaking, they weren't seemingly paying much attention. But with Mandela, they were paying attention. And in the New South Africa, there are 11 official languages. So they have interpreters and earplugs and so on for everybody there so you can understand. Yet Mandela spoke in English, Afrikaans, his own language, Xhosa, and Zulu and Sotho. I think I heard him speak 4 or 5 languages that day. And it was just interesting to see that this is this particular time of seeing Mandela in operation was actually seeing him doing his thing as the President of South Africa and the respect which he had in that National Assembly. The other time was a Rhodes Scholar reunion that we had in South Africa, and Mandela was the dinner speaker on that occasion, and there were hundreds and hundreds of us there. So as I say, he had no idea I was ever in his presence, but I was delighted, and it's been one of the highlights of my life to have been in that situation. Well, he grew up with a typical African kid's life, culturally African kid's life. His father had 3 wives. He was the son of the second wife. The father was around sometimes when he came to visit that wife. A polygamous society. There's still a considerable amount of polygamy in African culture. His father was a sort of prime minister for a man called the regent of the Tembo tribe of the Xhosa. And the regent lived some distance away from where Mandela grew up, but was really sort of a major tribal chief. So Mandela's father is part of the political power structure of the Xhosa tribe. And Mandela's father died when he was about 12 or 13. And it's pretty clear that then Mandela was picked out to be the replacement for his father as an advisor to the future regent. A man named Justice, or a young man named Justice. Justice is about 2 or 3 years older than Nelson Mandela. So they moved Mandela to the Great Place, it was called, which is where the regent lived, in several huts, sort of a small community. And then he's sent off to school. So he enters the mission school environment. And he goes through grade school and high school, and then on to Fort Hare University, which was clearly for that region, the best opportunity for a black person to be educated. And Justice goes with him, and Mandela and Justice become very close buddies, friends. So everything's going well, and then Mandela, even if I understood it, I wouldn't try to take time today to explain what happened at Fort Hare. But it was going into at the end of his second year, it's a 3-year course. There's elections for some student council, and these elections were historically manipulated by the head of the school. And Mandela is elected to the student council, but he so resents the manipulation that he refuses to serve. And so the head of the school, who's a Scotsman, Presbyterian, good Calvinist Scotsman, serving these young African kids, says, I'll give you the summer to think it over, but if you will not serve, you're going to be expelled. He thought it over, and the opportunities for an African person to get that kind of education and to get a Fort Hare degree. It's like within the black community being a Morehouse man. Morehouse in Atlanta. If you have a degree from Morehouse, you're at the highest echelon educationally and culturally. Mandela thinks it over that summer and decides he's not going to serve on the student council, so he gets expelled from Fort Hare. Now it says a lot about him. He's a person of principle and he's very stubborn. Very stubborn person. Well, also, sort of simultaneously, the regent has decided that Justice and Nelson Mandela will be married to 2 young women. And neither Justice nor Nelson want that marriage. So they run away from home. And they run away to Johannesburg. And in a sense, the rest is history. Mandela completely severs himself from what he was prepared to do, from his background, and enters into, as a very young man, into Johannesburg society, seeking jobs wherever he can get them. He initially works doesn't go down underground in the mines, but works in a fairly low supervisory position in the mines, and then gets himself attached actually to Walter Sisulu's real estate firm, and that's where he makes contact with Sisulu, and that's where he's radicalized. One of his fellow workers is a communist and a leader in the ANC, and radicalizes Nelson Mandela in the process. So that's sort of the background about how Mandela gets involved in African politics. Now, I'll come back to Mandela, obviously, as we go along, but he becomes let's put it this way, a sort of lower level leader within the ANC, not at the top echelon, maybe an intermediate, let's say intermediate level, because he's pretty talented, very dedicated, and he starts to take correspondence law course. He actually goes to Witwatersrand University Law School, and he just can't cut it. He's doing night classes and so on, and working full time. And he's a smart guy, but he's not an intellectual. And Witwatersrand is a high-powered South African law school. It's like trying to go to Yale or Harvard or Columbia or Michigan. and he just doesn't quite have what it takes, the background to do that. So he drops out and then over time gets his law degree by correspondence. But he does, in this process of political activity and various jobs, does become a lawyer, and that's when he and Oliver Tambo has become a lawyer. That's when he and Oliver Tambo set up this law firm. So they're both working on one side of the street, which is political activity, and the other side, they're serving black people as the only, imagine this, in Johannesburg, the only black law firm, and blacks don't feel they're going to get served very well in a white law firm, and most whites wouldn't take it. So they have their anteroom is just absolutely jam-packed with people all day long, with folks in need of legal services. And obviously they don't make much money in the process because they aren't able to charge very much. In 1955, a man named Z.K. Matthews, who was a professor at Fort Hare and had a lot of influence on both Mandela and Tambo when they were students, returned from being on leave and serving on, I forget which faculty he was in the United States, but he had a one-year stint as a faculty member in the U.S., came back and put together the document that you have in the handout. We have part of it. Actually, what you have is a section from Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela's autobiography, which contains the Freedom Charter. Mandela was at a place called Cliptown out in Soweto, a kind of open-air space within the Soweto ghetto. And Mandela was there, but was not participating in any sense in what was going on because he was, at the moment, was banned, which means that you could not, technically you're not supposed to be more than 3 or 4 people. And because of your political activity, the South African government had laws that would allow you to ban people or put you under house arrest. They could keep you, isolate you as a political leader, trying to isolate you from having political influence. So he and another banned person were standing up on the edges of what's going on and watching as the people subscribe to the Freedom Charter. Now this is an extraordinarily important document in the history of the struggle for freedom in South Africa, because it lays out the principles which will be the principles of the ANC and will be a part of what we'll see in the Bill of Rights of the South African Constitution, the rights that people should have. It's important to keep in mind that the ANC is not an exclusive organization. It's going to be a big battle, and always is in these matters, between whether you should allow whites to participate with blacks in the process of trying to gain freedom in resistance. And the ANC is going to be open to white people and always have whites in leadership positions. And so when the document talks about all the people in South Africa, it means all the people in South Africa. Blacks, whites, coloreds, Indians. So the ANC is in a very good position because of its openness. Now, a number of the organizations, and we'll talk about the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, are anti-white and won't allow whites to be part of the organization. And that, interestingly, becomes a kind of litmus test on communism, too, because a lot of the communist leadership is white. And many of the white leadership in the ANC were communists. And I mean, when you think about it, it's a natural gravitation for a freedom movement to move toward communism, at least the theory of communism, which is a classless society, and a society of sharing, from each according to his needs, and then, you know, and each of you should be prepared to perform according to your ability to perform. So there's no necessary correlation between your contribution and what you receive. This is why, you know, good American independents hate socialist-style communism, because it's leveling. You don't get what you deserve. Everybody gets what they need, and you contribute what you can contribute. And you may not get back nearly as much as you contribute because you have an ability to contribute more. It's a leveling process. And you can see what the kinds of huge inequality of wealth and position and so on that existed under apartheid in South Africa, why at least the theory of communism would be extremely appealing. And this is why it's so easy for the South African government to paint the ANC with this broad brush as a communist organization. And this is what made it so difficult for the United States and Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, to give any support to the South African freedom movement, because in so doing, they were afraid and feeling they were supporting a communist organization. It's the Cold War. So the Cold War positioned South Africa, at least the freedom struggle, looking to Russia for help, looking to China for help. Of course, that gets into a conflict too between Russia and China. But a lot of the training that ANC people receive is received in East Germany or in Russia. So there are all kinds of links between the ANC and the communist nations and communism as a phenomenon. Whereas on the other side, the Pan-African Congress was very anti-communist. So the US and Britain tended to support the PAC over the ANC, as an example. Cold War politics played in so deeply into African politics in this period that there's no way to separate. So let's look for a minute or a few minutes, it'll be more than a minute, I guess, at the Freedom Charter. If you may remember when we did I dragged you through the Constitution. Remember a point I made that the Articles of Confederation refers to we the states, whereas the preamble to the United States Constitution is we the people. So then there you get a sense of a nation rather than just an accumulation of states. Look at here, we the people of South Africa. And this is where this thing about whites are involved and color and so on. They mean we the people of South Africa, not just we the blacks. It's black people that are there at Cliptown subscribing to this, but they're talking about we the people. And notice that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. So a ringing democratic statement. This is going to be a democratic government where the government will be the result of the expression of the will of the people, is what they intend. But, it says, our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty, and peace by the form of government founded on injustice and inequality. And, again, I don't think they're not blowing smoke. This is true. And that our government will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in brotherhood, enjoying equal rights and opportunities. Again, I mean, this really is important. They're talking about brotherhood, sisterhood, we would say, whatever words we would use today, and that's not 1955. But they really are talking about a nation coming together. And that's one of those powerful things about Mandela and the ANC, is they really do envision a South Africa of whites and blacks living together in concert. Not easy to do. And the whites, of course, they don't believe it, most of them. And they feel that any one of these organizations, that their goal is going to be throw us out of the country. And these are South Africans who are 5th, 6th generation South Africans, the whites. So they're entrenched. And the ANC recognizes that. But I think in principle, they really do believe in all people working together. Certainly we'll see, and we know Mandela believed that. That only a democratic state based on the will of people can secure all their birthrights without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief. Okay, so the next paragraph says, accordingly, we're going to put together this Freedom Charter. And then it lays out this, by the way, the actual total Freedom Charter is a little bit longer. It's not much longer, but a little bit longer. Mandela in his autobiography is including just the major aspects of it. Okay, the people shall govern. Every man and woman shall have the right to vote for and stand as a candidate for all bodies which make laws. So again, when you get into a constitution, you have to decide who's eligible to be in government. What's the age, particularly age and so on. But they're talking about, you know, it is a democracy, a representative democracy, and you or I might get elected to the city council or to the state legislature of Iowa and so on. As citizens, that's one of the things that can happen to us, and as citizens, one of the things we might, maybe should, be interested in doing. I'm going to the next paragraph. All the people shall be entitled to take part in the administration of the country. So even administrators should be open to all. The rights of the people shall be the same regardless of race, color, or sex. Equal rights. All bodies of minority rule, advisory boards, councils, authorities shall be replaced by democratic organs of self-government. So this democracy, democracy, democracy permeates this document. All national groups shall have equal rights. Now this is interesting, because while we're talking about brotherhood and coming together, we don't have just divisions of white and black. The whites themselves are pretty badly divided, and the blacks are in these tribal groups, and they're coming out of a system which has the apartheid system really drives home the importance of the tribal group. And it's a divide and conquer strategy from the point of view of the government, although it's put out there openly as we have a great reverence for these individual groups of blacks. You should be able to be educated in your own language. As in this dumbed down form of apartheid education, they had school, if you were living in Johannesburg, you could go, you must go to a Venda school if you're a Venda speaker. You must go to a Xhosa school if you're a Xhosa speaker. And they divide them up in education according, and the education was conducted in the language, in the native language. And you know, you're only going through maybe 3 or 4 years of education, so in a way it's very convenient, in a way it's very nice, but also emphasizes the divisions of the blacks by being educated that way and speaking that language. Now but it was still on the other side important enough for the blacks to do this that somehow this new government's going to have to accommodate it. So here's where you get into this. National groups shall have equal rights. There shall be equal status in the bodies of state and the courts, etc. Notice I'm going down about halfway down. All people shall have equal rights to use their own language and to develop their own folk culture and customs. So here they're picking up something that the apartheid government actually did as well. And it's going to cause problems for the future of South Africa because, I mean, think of it if we had this in our Constitution today, that we have, 11 languages that are enshrined in a Bill of Rights and protected constitutionally, and everybody has a right to education in their own language, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, this accommodation to the practicality that they face, I think, runs somewhat counter to the idea of everyone coming together. And notice that just the next paragraph, the preaching and practice of national, race, or color discrimination and contempt shall be a punishable crime. If we had that in place today, would Donald Trump be indicted for some of the things that he's saying? Excuse me for that little political. And then all apartheid laws and practices shall be set aside. Now, this next session is really important because it's all important, but for future developments. One of the concerns that the world is going to have as the new South Africa emerges is it going to be a socialist South Africa or will it be a capitalist South Africa? And, business leaders who are thinking about investment in South Africa, that's a big issue. How much investment are you going to get if it's a socialist South Africa versus a capitalist South Africa? And so the fear that the Western governments, European and American governments had as to what would emerge economically in South Africa is partly sparked by what's in the Freedom Charter. The national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. What does that mean? We're going to restore the wealth of the country to the people. Does that mean people collectively own the wealth of the country? What does it mean? The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. Well, doesn't that sound like socialism to you? Somehow we're going to have publicly owned industries and so on. All other industries and trade shall be controlled to assist the well-being of the people. Now that's somewhat less direct, but somehow the goal of all these things is the well-being of the people. All people shall have equal rights to trade where they choose to manufacture and to enter all trades, crafts, and professions. Then you go to the next one, the land shall be shared among all those who work it. Now remember, you're facing a situation where after 1913, steadily, land ownership rights are being withdrawn from Africans, so that the only place they can be said to be legally owning anything is in their tribal reserves, and then oftentimes those things are held in common rather than individually. That's okay from the African point of view. Commonly held lands is okay, but it needs to be African, not white. So, restrictions of land ownership on racial basis shall be ended and all the land redivided amongst those who work it to banish famine and land hunger. So does this mean we're going to have collective farms or what? Once the new South Africa emerges, are you going to break up the commercial farms, which are highly viable, terrifically productive farms, and divide them up into little teeny patches so that the people who live out there and can maybe be drawn from the urban areas and live on the land and farm? It's that distinction that I told you about when we flew from Johannesburg into Lesotho. Of all these big farms that look like Iowa in the Free State, and then we cross the Caledon River and it looks like a teeny patchwork and built everywhere a village. Now you can say a lot for that actually. Those folks are living okay. I mean they're not starving. And it's a traditional African life. But are you going to break all that up in South Africa in order to recreate the traditional way of farming? And in the process, are you going to lose a lot of ultimately of productivity and commercial farming? It will become much more subsistent. How can you have a tractor, sustain a tractor on just a few acres of land and so on? So it is an issue that South Africa still faces because they haven't redivided them. Zimbabwe, Mugabe said he was going to do it, and he kicked the Europeans out, but then he tended to give the land to his cronies. So it didn't really get divided up very well anyway. So I think Joanne's showing me a picture of a clock. If I'm thinking properly, that means I should stop. And you should start being active yourselves, so let's do that.
Chairs, folks. You're getting very well trained. Coming here right away. I think you may want to take a close look at George today, because when you see him next week, he's going to be a year older than he is today. So happy birthday to George tomorrow. You know, when I was much younger, like 70, I thought that by the time you get to be 80, it was rocking chair time. And it's people like you and George who set a high bar for the rest of us. And we're happy that you're here and happy that George is a good example for all of us. So we'll turn it back to George and have him finish the last half of the class.
Yeah, sure. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear George. Happy birthday to you.
Well, thank you very much. Joanne, I have to include Joanne in this because our class is coming up on its 60th year. We had our reunion actually with the Stan's class last year, class of 55. But as I was just talking to some of the track kids the other day, And I said, I am to you as someone from 1896 was to me. It blows my mind. So I guess, but for you folks, I mean, there are some of you in this room I know are older than I am. I'm looking at 2 World War II veterans here who I know are considerably older. So anyway, maybe I'll get there. Okay, now I'm looking at my outline here, and I realize some of the things that lie ahead I've already touched on, so I think I'm going to get through it. But you know me, I tend to slow down with things. I'm going to very quickly sort of go through the unfolding struggle. As I indicated, the Pan-African Congress is a rival organization established in 1960 that rivals the ANC. And I talked about the anti-communist aspects of it. They were the ones who were in the very center of something that many of us in this room will remember, the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960. It was an anti-pass demonstration in front of a police station where about 60 people were killed. That was a PAC-inspired event. It was not an ANC event. And that immediately, this is right in the year that they founded, that they were immediately propelled into international as well as national recognition because of their deep involvement in the Sharpeville Massacre. And they're going to, the PAC is going to be, tends to be, have more support internationally within Africa itself. I mean, after all, the name Pan-African Congress. And so ANC, Mandela, for example, when he traveled around South Africa, had a hard time trying to explain how the ANC might be a better organization than the PAC. Well, in 1961, Hage Verwoerd, the Prime Minister of South Africa, takes a huge step with the support of the Parliament. They separate from the British Empire in 1961. And the Union of South Africa, as it was officially known, became the Republic of South Africa. So the official name changed. And when Sue and I were in the Peace Corps in Lesotho, and we were, you know, people traveling back and forth to South Africa all the time, the term would be, we're going to the Republic. We're going to the Republic. That was the term that was used, and the label that was given to South Africa. Well, that event happened in 1961. And in reaction, partly in reaction to that, but a reaction to the kinds of things that happened after Sharpeville, Mandela becomes the principal advocate with the ANC for a violence campaign against the government. So it has to be said, at this point in his career, Mandela became a terrorist. He became the leader. He, first of all, had to argue with the executive of the ANC, and finally won his position. And he deals with this a lot in his autobiography, and it was dealt with at the time. A number of ANC people were subscribers to Mohandas Gandhi's principles of nonviolent resistance, and that had tended to be the style that they'd adopted up to that time. And Mandela is going to argue, this regime does not have a conscience. Yeah, if you agree with the British government, which does have a conscience, maybe, or within the American situation, which is yet to come, the civil rights movement and King, who does follow Gandhian principles, if you're dealing with a ultimate regime, i.e. the federal government, which might have a conscience, maybe this will work. Mandela argues strongly that you've got to fight violence with violence. That's the only thing these folks will understand. And they're so oppressive that the only way to resist is to embark on a campaign of violence against them. Now, it has to be said, it was meant to be a campaign of violence against things, not people. They were not setting out to blow up people. Now, inevitably, when you blow up places, you blow up people. And so people did get killed. They also sent younger cadres of ANC folks off to East Germany and Russia to be trained militarily. And then they come back. And so there was a kind of, they're trying to create a kind of guerrilla force. Interestingly, when Mandela and his fellow prisoners are being flown from Pretoria and Johannesburg to Cape Town to be put in Robben Island, what they're doing as they fly over the countryside is looking down for places where, in fact, guerrillas might be able to survive. They're still thinking in these terms. And South Africa is kind of a tough place to conduct a guerrilla war, much harder than a jungle place. There are some places where guerrillas can hide out and so on, but a lot of it's pretty open. So Mandela becomes the leader of this armed wing of ANC, and as such becomes a hunted man. And ultimately, and it's much more complicated than the story I'm telling, but ultimately he is captured along with a lot of the ANC leadership. The ANC has by this time been banned, and the group of leaders surrounded Oliver Tambo have moved to Lusaka in Zambia, and that becomes the headquarters for the ANC in exile. So you're going to have a cadre, a group in the technical leadership of the ANC, which is in exile in Zambia, and you're going to have the folks in the country conducting their military campaign and so on, and then finally you're going to get the people who are imprisoned in Robben Island after what's called the Rivonia trial in the early 1960s, where they were on trial for their life. And I was asking in the hallway about that, and why was it? Greg Bonzat asked me, why was it that Mandela was not executed? Well, as it happened, the judge, and it was a single judge for that trial, happened to have been appointed by the United Party prior to 1948, and was definitely a person who upheld the law over politics. And it was a near thing, but none of the Rivonia trial, those who have been charged in that trial, were executed. All were given life sentences. And Robben Island, and I guess we can, Jim would put up that South African map. Robben Island, here's Cape Town. And Robben Island, can you see that little dot there? That's it. 8 miles up the shore. It's a sort of Alcatraz of South Africa, where they put the hardest criminal cases and the hardest political cases. And Mandela will not serve all 27 years in Robben Island. He is moved after about 18 years off of Robben Island to a place called Polesmore, which is actually in Cape Town. And then in his final year and a half or so in prison, he's in a very, very nice situation in a place called Paarl, P-A-A-R-L, Victor Verster prison, and it was, he had a house to himself and a servant taking care of him and so on. So by this time, the last year and a half or so, he's in a very pleasant kind of imprisonment. I'm going to say, try to confine myself to just one or two things about Mandela's time in prison. It transformed him, really. The Nelson Mandela we know from his period out of prison and serving as president of South Africa. How many of you have seen the movie Invictus? Okay, we in fact showed it the other night to my tutorial students. I tried to show it at the end of the fall semester and couldn't get it downtown, so I bought it and we saw it just a week or so ago. The Nelson Mandela, who in an effort to bring South Africa together, becomes a supporter of the South African rugby team. Now, rugby is the quintessential sport of the Afrikaners. The blacks played soccer, football. There were no English people on the rugby team. They weren't rugby folks. And his reaching out to that team against the advice of most of his ANC government folks and so on was symbolic of the effort that he makes to bring South Africa together. We'll talk in a few moments about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well. While in prison, Mandela became fluent in Afrikaans. His jailers were speakers of Afrikaans. They were either whites or colored jailers. He made it his business to study his enemy and understand his enemy. He became the quintessential jailhouse lawyer. He was a lawyer. He knew what the law, he knew and learned what the law of prisons was. He constantly confounded his jailers by quoting the law to them, which they didn't know. And he managed to gain all kinds of things for his fellow prisoners and for himself by his skillful use of the law that he knew about incarceration. He developed, I would say, a sense of appreciation for and respect for some Afrikaners. He really did try to bridge that gap. He mellowed. I guess the simplest thing is to say is he really did mellow during those days, so that very mellow figure we used to see after he came out of prison was a Mandela who was constructed during those 27 years in prison. Now, toward the end of that imprisonment, and it's the reason they're moving him and some of the other prisoners away from Robben Island, is the government is beginning to decide that this regime cannot go on as it is going on in perpetuity. Changes are going to have to be made. I've talked about this before. I think it was in the first lecture, the fact that the business community in particular is bringing a lot of pressure on the apartheid government because of the international sanctions. The economy was in decline, it was in recession, and it's still not quite clear whether that recession was caused by the sanctions, international sanctions, but there definitely was correlated with those international sanctions. And from the point of view of the government, they become convinced that the game is not going to go on forever in the same way. And also, it is in response to their effort increasingly isolate, their increasing isolation. In the mid-70s, there was a revolution in Portugal. Now, how was that going to affect things in South Africa? Well, we can't see it on this map, but there's a little bit of Mozambique there, Portuguese colony, and above Southwest Africa or Namibia is Angola. And those were two Portuguese colonies which, as a result of that revolution in Portugal, gained their freedom. Now, they're both going to be engaged in long civil wars. Two rival groups trying to lead the nation. And those civil wars go on for a very long time. But South Africa now is isolated by that. When Zimbabwe becomes, and Zimbabwe's right up in here, when Zimbabwe gained its freedom in 1980, that's yet another of a nation that no longer is being protected by a colonial power, but has become an independent nation. So there's physical isolation that's happening to South Africa, and then international sanctions are developed. 1976, Soweto. The two things that Americans remember, I think, would be Sharpeville, 1960, Soweto, 1976. When the government tried to impose Afrikaans language on the high schools. And a lot of that would be a shift from English to Afrikaans, and the students rebelled. And that rebellion spread and led to all, by this time these things are being televised internationally, and the bloodshed, repression comes down in the aftermath of the Soweto riots is huge, and is really a landmark event in the development of South Africa, and its increasing isolation, increasing defensiveness of this government. And how long can you build defenses against what seems to be the tide of history and strengthening of apartheid? And by the time you get to the early 1980s, there is violence everywhere. And you have state of emergency and tremendous repression from the government. see what other, well, I'm trying to go here pretty quickly over this material. It's the government of P.W. Botha, who becomes Prime Minister in 1978, leaves office after a heart attack in 1989 as the President. There's a new constitution that's put forward in 1986, which changes the legislative process slightly, but more dramatically, instead of a Prime Minister now, you have a person called the President, the state President. So that particular, and that's again a move to try to strengthen the apartheid government in a very defensive way. And they're simply, it's a losing game. I mean, we from the outside can see it as a losing game, though you wonder how long that losing game can play out, because, and this never changes, the South African government has huge military power. They have conscription, so they can build large armies. They are well equipped, and there's a period in there when they become a nuclear power. South Africa was, the apartheid government was for a time a nuclear power. I mean, the new South Africa has given that all up. They're not nuclear now. They were during a few years of the apartheid government. So then, you know, how are you going to overthrow something like that? It's determined to hang on. And yet, from the inside, you could see the rot is developing in the sense of this cannot go on forever. And I think that definitely was what was happening in South Africa. So they moved Mandela. I will get into some of this negotiation process. They moved Mandela away from Robben Island onto the actual continent, South African continent, where they could reach him, and they begin to pull him out of prison for a day to come and talk to them. Now, it's never Botha. At one point, Mandela does meet Botha. And it's just a sort of a formal kind of exchange situation where they get to know each other. But members of the apartheid government are begin to negotiate with Mandela. Now, what's happening, it's really interesting. Mandela goes into prison as a leader, but not the face of the ANC. But the Lusaka government has made him the face of the ANC. Free Mandela. We all remember that. Free Mandela. He becomes the face of the opposition. It's really interesting to see how this person who's been built up by the Lusaka government, can he fulfill the image that's been created of him as the great leader, the great hope. Interestingly enough, I think he does. But there's no assurance that that will happen. Also, there's tension between Mandela and Lusaka. How can he communicate with Lusaka what's going on in these negotiations? They're afraid he's going to sell them out. To get out of prison. And the one thing Mandela holds to, they say you're going to have to give up the armed struggle before we'll let you out. He says we'll never give up the armed struggle until we're out and we can begin to negotiate with you as free people and equal people. Otherwise we've got to keep the armed struggle going. Or they would say, we'll let you out. He said, no, I won't come out until we've resolved the issues that separate us. So this goes on, we didn't know it, I certainly didn't, for 4 or 5 years. Back and forth, back and forth. And then with Tambo and the Lusaka government off there wondering what's going on, there were ways that Mandela was able to communicate with them, but they weren't direct ways, it was through intermediaries and so on. His lawyers, he had access to lawyers who'd come in and he had ways of getting messages to them to pass on to Lusaka, say, you know, I'm not selling you out, I'm not selling you out, this is what I'm holding for, and so on. But eventually, with Botha's heart attack, it's not unclear what would happen if Botha stayed in power. He's replaced by the man that Botha least wanted to replace him, F.W. de Klerk, who is a more moderate person, certainly, than P.W. Botha was. And so, it's within, what, 8 months or so of P.W. Botha coming into power that he then releases Nelson Mandela. And we have this great event in February of 1990 with Mandela walking out of prison. Now, and again, I want to looking at the time here, how much time to spend on this process. But as you begin to have formal negotiations, they were called CODESAs, that's the act, C-O-D-E-S-A, Congress for a Democratic South Africa, was the official name of the negotiating meeting, which had, and you shouldn't think of it as a single meeting, it's a group of people who come together, then stop, come together, then stop. And in fact, during one of those negotiations, this is while Sue and I were in Lesotho, we remember very well, the AWB, which was these Afrikaners with their broad-brimmed hats, socks up to their knees, and short pants, and looking like, 300 pounds. They drove a truck through the glass window where the CODESA was meeting, which was in a event, what do I want to say, a sort of, well, it's a large meeting hall out by Jan Smuts Airport in Johannesburg. They just drove this truck right in to try to break up the meeting. All sorts of, it was a wild period, this negotiation period. There's more violence in that period than there was at any other time. Now, I need to mention the Inkatha Freedom Party. That's another of the fragmented opposition of blacks. It represented the Zulus. And the Zulu-Xhosa rival is huge. The majority of black leadership of the ANC is Xhosa. And the Zulus and the Xhosa there's a lot of conflict between them. And so the Zulus create their own party, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and it was always a question of whether they would even enter into the negotiations. Now there's a fair amount of evidence that under de Klerk, they armed IFP folks and urged them to attack ANC folks. And so within the hostels, at the mines, on trains, taking people from Soweto into Johannesburg or in Durban, you would have IFP people attacking ANC people and killing them, or ANC people attacking IFP people and killing them. So there's a lot, just a lot of this going on. And now, and subsequently, it came out that the government was actually feeding that process, hoping that they could stave off the ultimate, that, they're into this negotiation, but do they really want to be there? In 1992, there was a by-election in a place called Potchefstroom, and the Conservative Party candidate beat the National Party candidate. Now, the Conservative Party was taking the position, stop the negotiations. We aren't going to go. They're the most right. It's been formed with the most right-wing folks. And so de Klerk takes a big chance. He has a national referendum or plebiscite which says, should we continue the CODESA process, the negotiating process, or shall we stop? And I'm not sure what he'd done if he got a vote against it. They actually, it was 62%, and this was just the white population that voted. 62% of the white population, 1992 says go forward. So that was enough of a mandate for de Klerk to continue the negotiating process. So on one side, he's negotiating, and on another side, his government is fueling violence. It's wild, and nobody knew what was going to come out of this. Would the negotiations lead anywhere or not? Well, what finally sort of breaks the logjam is a white member of the ANC executive, a Jew named Joe Slovo, one of the brightest persons in the ANC, who said, this government at the moment, that is to say the white National Party government, is not really ready to move to a totally democratic South Africa. They're talking power sharing. We'll share some power with you. The blacks are saying, that's not majority rule. We are the majority. We'll accommodate you and we'll be part of the new South Africa, but we'll go the direction that the votes go. Not an artificial coming together of whites and blacks in some sort of shared government. Well, Slovo says, well, let's create an interim constitution for 5 years, see how that goes, and then we'll renegotiate and try to form a constitution for the ultimate South Africa. And that's what they do. So when Nelson Mandela was elected in 1994, the government was going to last for 5 years under a provisional constitution that had power sharing. The party with the second highest votes, which turned out to be the National Party, would have the vice presidency. The party that had the most votes would have the presidency. That was Mandela. So that that government, though Mandela was president, was a power-sharing government. They needed, for one thing, they needed South Africa apartheid government administrators, civil servants, and those folks were kept in their jobs in order to keep the country running. So it's a two-step process. Most of us think of it as 1994 democratic South Africa. Not quite there yet. People are all voting. It's the first free election that they've had. But the result is a power-sharing government. Now, with the ANC as the most powerful part of that government, but with the whites with real power within that government. And then in 1999, Mandela steps down. He does not run for leadership of the party. The leader of the majority party is going to be the president. And you're going to get the government of Thabo Mbeki. Mbeki, interestingly enough, was in Lusaka. He was their foreign minister in Lusaka, negotiated with European, American powers and so on. So this is a rivalry. Is the leadership going to be the Robben Island folks, the folks who stayed back in South Africa and went through prison, or is the leadership going to be the Lusaka folks? Tambo, when he came back, was in poor health, and there was no question. In fact, he stepped aside, and Mandela became the leader of the ANC at that point, after he got out of prison. So, I think what I want to do now, I mean, I've gone through this fairly quickly, but I hope I haven't confused you, is to say a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation process under the Nelson Mandela government. Now again, you're a population against whom crime after crime after crime has been committed against you by the government, by quote, your government. I mean, real crimes. People being eliminated, thrown out of buildings, and interrogation. You've got Steve Biko, who is beaten up by the police, left with a severe brain injury, thrown into the back of a van and driven 800 miles, naked, being driven 800 miles from Port Elizabeth up to Pretoria, and his dies. And it was a result of interrogation. He says in his own work that if they tried to interrogate me, I'm going to fight back. And he probably did fight back, and they slammed him against the wall and so on. But Biko's Black Consciousness movement is another one of those movements, and I had intended to read just a little bit of that. I'm diverting here because I forgot to do this. For Dave Ferguson's purposes, for Dave, the great South African is Biko. By the way, Mandela never mentions Biko in his book. It's very interesting. So there is a real rivalry here. Biko is the Black Consciousness person. And I want to just read you a paragraph of a kind, and he's a brilliant, brilliant writer, and Ron Charles will talk about him, because Ron knew him. They were in medical school together. In an essay called We Blacks, he was the leader of a student movement, and all of his writing was in their newsletter. It's a student movement newsletter, that is, I write what I like, comes out of. And an absolutely brilliant writer. And he says, all in all, the black man has become a shell, a shadow of a man, completely defeated, drowning in his own misery, a slave, an ox bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. This is the first truth, bitter as it may seem, that we have to acknowledge before we can start on any program designed to change the status quo. It becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. So the situation is, the only way things are going to change is if black people make them change, and the black people have been turned into shells. How do you give black people the pride and fill those shells that they can actually move toward their freedom? The first step, therefore, is to make the black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused, and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This is what we mean by an inward-looking process. This is the definition of black consciousness. And then, interestingly enough, this essay just goes on to extol the wonderful things about black people and black culture. So you've got people like, this brilliant guy, leader, Steve Biko, who's absolutely destroyed by the apartheid government. All of this has happened in the background. So, the new South Africa, what are you going to do? Deal with the past or move forward? And Mandela, who has all sorts of authenticity, 27 years in prison. He wasn't killed, but he suffered a lot from the apartheid government, is front and center saying, we've got to forget the past. We have to deal with the past in a way that allows us to focus on all of these many problems we face and not wallow in the past and use all of our energy in reprisals against the people who did so many things to us. So you enter into the truth and reconciliation process where the people, the apartheid folks who have committed the crimes, if they are truthful about that, if they admit it in a court-like situation, a hearing, then they can proceed toward reconciliation and avoid punishment. It's an amazing process, and obviously not everyone in the ANC went along with it, particularly as there were ANC people who had blown people up who had to do the same thing. It worked both ways. It wasn't just the whites who had to do it, the blacks had to do it as well. And this was regarded by many in the ANC as really unfair, that the people who had committed some crime just as a result of having been so punished themselves, that they shouldn't be equated with the apartheid government. But it was an even-handed process that went forward and did, in fact, I think, work pretty well and allow them to concentrate on the huge problems that they face. So that one could go into that a lot. One of my greatest regrets is I was in South Africa when this was going on in a town called George. And the TRC was meeting that day, and I didn't stop and go to it. I was traveling. I should have gone. I would love to have been there and sat through one of those hearings. Now, you have two other handouts here, and we'll be able to spend a little time with one of them and not with the other, but that's okay. The one that says Issues Confronting New South Africa, this is dated. It's from 1998. And it's something I gave my class. But look at that. A lot of the issues that are there are still facing South Africa. But this gives you an idea of the kind of issues that confronted this government. And then I just want to call, we've got about 5 minutes to look at the selections from the South African Bill of Rights. This is truly selections. It's a 13-page document. And just think of it. I said this before, but our one-page Bill of Rights, and think of how much litigation surrounds the Bill of Rights. A lot of American litigation is litigating the Bill of Rights. Various and sundry violations of the Bill of Rights. You got 13 pages of Bill of Rights to violate in South Africa. And fortunately, they're not a litigious society, at least yet. But, for example, just an example, look at that first one. Everyone has the right to freedom and security of persons, which includes the right to make decisions concerning reproduction. Roe v. Wade. Here it is, right in the Constitution. Reproduction decisions are individual decisions. They cannot be dictated by law of the state. Freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. Freedom of artistic creativity. Think of the National Endowment for the Arts and things that happen as a result of funding of art that people don't like, or in that federal government. Academic freedom. My fellow academic folks, wouldn't it be nice to have that enshrined in our Constitution? Freedom of research. Labor relations. Everyone has the right to form and join a trade union. To strike. Our son works for the Detroit school system. It's now illegal for a teacher to strike in Michigan. They can sick out, which they've done. They can't strike. Environment. Everyone has a right to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being. Have an environment protected for the benefit and present and future generations. Through reasonable legislation and other measures that prevent pollution. And this is in the Constitution. Well, you know, when you come out of what they've been through, you can see this energy. We can energetically put something out there that will protect us from now on. Property. Public interests include the nation's commitment to land reform, and the reforms bring about equitable access to all South African natural resources. That's one that hasn't happened particularly, and you wonder how long it's going to be before people begin to bring cases against the government for things that aren't happening. And there's more about that. We're running out of time, but do look at that. Look at the bottom page. A person or community dispossessed of property after 19 June 1913. That's the law that began to force Africans off the land. As a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices entitled to the extent provided by an act of Parliament either restitution of that property or to equitable redress. They haven't done that. But there it is in their Bill of Rights that you've got a right to do that. Housing. Everyone has a right to have access to adequate housing. On the next page. And there should be legislative process to provide that. Health care, food, water, and Social Security. Everyone has the right to access to health care services, including reproductive health, sufficient food and water, and Social Security. Every child has the right to family care and parental care, etc. Education. Everyone has the right to basic education, including adult basic education, further education, which the state must take responsible measures to make progressively available and accessible. Everyone has the right to receive education in the official language or languages of their choice. And that, again, isn't happening. Most of the education is in English or in Afrikaans. Language and culture, this is where the 11 languages are given protection by the Constitution. Well, as I say, there's more. But my mind gets blown easily, obviously. But it does blow my mind to think about what that would be like in this society if we had those guaranteed rights. They have them in South Africa. All right. Well, next week we're going to get Ron Charles and some really authentic experiences from life in South Africa. And I thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. This is spellbinding. Next week, as George said, Dr. Ron Charles will be here, and an older Professor Drake will join us as well. So thank you very much for coming this morning, and we hope to see you all next week.